I slept with my cousin's husband and paid the price. Years later, the truth came out. It began on a gray afternoon that smelled like rain, secrets, and something I didn't yet have a name for. I was 22, still figuring out who I was supposed to be, while my cousin Eve seemed to already have everything: confidence, stability, and a love story that looked like it belonged in a movie. She had just moved back to the city after 3 years abroad with her husband Andrew. They were that kind of couple everyone admired: stylish, successful, inseparable. When they walked into a room, people noticed, not because they demanded attention, but because their presence quietly filled the air. Eve was 6 years older than me and had always been the cousin I looked up to. She was the one who helped me through my awkward teenage years, who taught me how to do my makeup, who told me to never settle for less than I deserved. She was more like a sister than a cousin, the kind of person you couldn't imagine ever hurting. When she texted me one Sunday afternoon saying, "We should catch up soon. Come over for dinner next week," I smiled like a kid. I had missed her warmth, her laughter. What I didn't realize was that this dinner would mark the start of a slow, quiet collapse I wouldn't be able to stop. I remember the night vividly: the sound of thunder rolling in the distance, the soft jazz playing from their living room, and the smell of roasted chicken mixed with white wine. Eve opened the door with her usual excitement, hugged me tightly, and pulled me inside before I could even close my umbrella. "You look beautiful," she said, holding me at arm's length. "My little cousin's all grown up." I laughed, a little shyly, as Andrew appeared from the kitchen holding a wine bottle. "You're just in time," he said, smiling in that calm, confident way he always did. His voice was deep, his presence steady. He wasn't what I'd call handsome in the obvious sense. There was just something assured about him. The kind of man who looked like he always knew what he was doing. We sat around the table, eating, laughing, talking about everything and nothing. Eve kept refilling my plate. Andrew kept refilling my glass. When she got up to take a phone call, halfway through dinner, it was just the two of us. The silence wasn't awkward. It was charged. He asked me about my new job, my apartment, and my love life. I told him I'd recently gotten out of a relationship that had left me feeling unsure about men in general. He listened, nodding thoughtfully, and said, "Sometimes people aren't ready for someone who actually feels deeply. You seem like the kind who does." I should have ignored that. I should have smiled politely, changed the topic. But I didn't. His words made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in a long time. It was just a sentence, yet it planted something dangerous. When I left that night, Eve hugged me tightly and told me she wanted us to start spending more time together again. "I've missed you," she said. Andrew walked me to my car, holding an umbrella over both of us as the rain came down hard. I remember glancing up at him when we reached the car door, noticing the way the rain ran down his jawline, and for a moment, something electric passed between us. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but I felt it. And I knew he did too. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other often. Eve would invite me over for brunches, family get-togethers, movie nights. Sometimes she'd get busy with work and ask Andrew to drop something off for me: leftovers, a bottle of wine, even a book she thought I'd like. Those small moments started to blur lines I didn't even know existed. A text from him here and there turned into conversations that stretched into the night. Harmless, I told myself. He was family. I had no reason to feel nervous when I saw his name light up my phone. But the truth is, I did. It started with subtle compliments. "You've got such a beautiful mind," he texted one night. Another time, "You remind me of the kind of person I wish I'd met earlier in life." I remember staring at that message for a long time, my heart racing, my stomach twisting with something I refused to call attraction. When I finally replied, it wasn't to encourage him, but it wasn't to stop him either. I said, "You shouldn't say things like that." He replied, "You're right." Then a pause. "But I mean it." From there, everything spiraled. The first time we crossed the line was a mistake that didn't feel like one. Eve had traveled for a weekend retreat with her company and asked me to stop by the house to feed their cat. I didn't know Andrew was still home. When I walked in, he was sitting in the living room, reading. He smiled, stood up, and offered me a drink. I almost said no, but I didn't. We talked about music, about life, about how lonely marriage can be even when you love someone. He spoke softly, vulnerably, like a man carrying a secret. At one point, I said something that made him laugh, and he looked at me, really looked at me. It was the kind of look that makes the air between two people shift. I should have left right then, but instead, I froze. He reached out, brushed a strand of hair from my face, and for a few seconds, neither of us moved. When he kissed me, it was like every rational thought vanished. I kissed him back. The sound of rain against the windows, the faint smell of whiskey on his breath, the weight of his hand on my back, all of it is burned into my memory, not as something beautiful, but as something irreversible. When it was over, we sat in silence. I couldn't look at him. "This can't happen again," I whispered. He nodded, eyes filled with something that looked a lot like regret. "I know," he said, but he lied, and so did I. Because it did happen again and again. Each time felt like drowning, terrified, guilty, but unable to stop. Every time I saw Eve, guilt clawed at my insides. She would hug me, tell me about her plans with Andrew, how happy they were, and I'd smile, pretending my heart wasn't rotting from the inside. I hated myself, but not enough to stop. Addiction doesn't always come in bottles or needles. Sometimes it comes in the shape of a man you should never have touched. I didn't know how it would end, only that it would. And when it finally did, it destroyed everything in its path. The weeks after that first night blurred together like a memory I couldn't separate from a dream. Everything I did seemed to revolve around hiding something I couldn't even name out loud. I'd wake up with my stomach in knots, go about my day pretending everything was fine, and then lie awake at night thinking about the look on his face, the way he'd said, "This can't happen again," even though both of us knew it would. I told myself it was just a phase, a reckless Temporary mistake that would fade with time. But mistakes like that don't fade, they grow roots. The more we tried to suppress it, the more it spread through everything we touched. Andrew started finding excuses to see me. Sometimes it was as small as a text saying, "Can we talk?" Or, "I just need to clear my head." He'd pick me up under the guise of running errands or meeting somewhere neutral, and each time, I promised myself I'd end it. But then we'd talk for hours. About life, about feeling unseen, about choices we couldn't take back, and every conversation drew us deeper into something neither of us had control over anymore. The guilt was constant. It lived inside me like a second heartbeat. Whenever Eve called, I'd answer with a smile that didn't reach my voice. She'd talk about weekend plans with Andrew, her job, how much she missed me. Every word was a reminder that I was betraying the one person who had never done anything to deserve it. I wanted to confess, to tell her everything, but I was a coward. Cowards don't confess, they justify, and I did that too well. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Sunday afternoon. Eve had invited me to brunch at their house. I told myself I'd act normal, that I'd be strong enough to face them both without letting my guilt show. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something was off. The air was heavy, still. Eve was in the kitchen, silent, her back turned. Andrew was on the couch, staring at the floor. When she finally turned around, I saw it, the look in her eyes that told me she knew. "How long?" she asked quietly. I froze, my throat closed up. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry. She just stood there, trembling, holding her phone in one hand. "How long?" she repeated. I glanced at Andrew, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. That silence between us, thick, suffocating, was all the confirmation she needed. Her breath hitched, and then it broke. She threw the phone onto the counter, the screen shattering on impact. "You of all people," she whispered. "My own cousin." The world seemed to tilt sideways. I tried to reach for her, to say something, anything, but she backed away like my touch might burn her. "Don't," she said, her voice shaking. "Don't you dare touch me." I'd always imagined that getting caught would bring relief, that maybe, once the truth was out, the weight of hiding it would finally lift. But it didn't. It only got heavier. Eve sank to the floor, crying in a way I'd never heard before. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the kind that sounds like something inside you has been ripped out. Andrew tried to speak, stammering useless apologies, but she didn't even look at him. Her pain was directed at me, and I deserved every bit of it. When she finally looked up, her face was red, streaked with tears, her voice hoarse. "You were like my sister," she said. "I trusted you with everything. And you," she shook her head, unable to finish. "How could you do this to me?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. She told me to leave. Andrew didn't stop me. As I walked out of the house, I could hear her sobbing behind the closed door. The sound followed me down the street, into my car, into my dreams for months afterward. After that day, everything collapsed. Eve cut all contact. My family found out soon after, how I never learned, but word travels fast when shame is involved. My mother couldn't look at me for weeks. My aunt, Eve's mother, called me a curse. I moved to another city, tried to rebuild a life from the wreckage I'd created, but guilt isn't something you can escape with distance. It lives in your chest, in the quiet moments, in the mirror when you catch your own reflection and remember what you did. Andrew tried reaching out a few times, calls I didn't answer, messages I deleted without reading. He and Eve divorced a few months later. Part of me wanted to hate him, to shift the blame his way, but the truth was, we were both guilty. We both destroyed her. For a long time, I didn't believe I deserved to feel anything but pain. I didn't date, didn't go out, didn't let myself be happy. Whenever I met someone new, I pushed them away before they could see who I really was. Because underneath everything, my new apartment, my new city, my new life, I was still that girl who had betrayed the one person she loved most. There were nights I'd lie awake and replay every moment leading up to that betrayal. If I had said no that first night, if I had ignored his messages, if I had confessed sooner, maybe things would have been different. But regret doesn't change the past, it just keeps it alive. Then, years later, I saw Eve again. It was at a family funeral, our grandmother's. I almost didn't go, afraid of what it would feel like to stand in the same room as her again. But I couldn't stay away. I needed to see her, even if she couldn't stand to see me. When she arrived, I barely recognized her. She looked stronger, calmer, like someone who had rebuilt herself from ashes. She wore a black dress, her hair neatly pinned, her face composed. When our eyes met, something inside me broke all over again. I wanted to run to her, to say I'm sorry 1,000 times, but I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, as she walked past me without a word. Later, during the service, I sat a few rows behind her, watching her shoulders rise and fall with every breath. She never once turned around. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't something I was owed. It was something she had already given herself by letting go of me completely. After the ceremony, I walked outside into the sunlight and cried. Not because of grief for the person we'd lost, but for the version of myself that I'd destroyed. The years that followed felt like living in slow motion, as if time itself was punishing me by making every moment drag. I moved to another city within months of everything falling apart, not because I had a plan, but because I couldn't bear to see the shadows of what I destroyed. Every street corner reminded me of Eve. Every sound of rain pulled me back to that night when everything began. I rented a small apartment, started a new job, and told people I was just restarting my life. What I didn't tell them was that I was drowning quietly, suffocating under a guilt that never loosened its grip. Guilt isn't loud. It doesn't scream or rage. It whispers. It seeps into your morning coffee, your mirror reflections, your silence at dinner. It was in everything I did. Some days, I'd wake up and convince myself I'd finally forgiven myself, that I'd served enough punishment. But then I'd walk past a couple laughing in the street, and something inside me would twist so hard it hurt to breathe. I had destroyed a marriage, a family bond, a friendship, and no amount of time or distance could undo it. Andrew had tried contacting me once after the divorce. He sent a short message, "I hope you're okay." I stared at those 4 words for hours. What was I supposed to say? No, I'm not okay, and I'll never be. I deleted it without replying. I didn't want to open that door again. The truth was, whatever we'd shared wasn't love. It was loneliness disguised as connection, desire dressed up as destiny. And while he had the option of rebuilding somewhere else, starting fresh, I didn't. My name, my conscience, everything about me felt stained. The first year was the hardest. I lost weight, lost sleep, lost the version of myself that believed I was a good person. I threw myself into work, took extra shifts, filled my time with anything that could distract me from my thoughts. But nights were brutal. That's when memories came alive. The look on Eve's face, the sound of her crying, the moment she said my own cousin. Those words echoed in my head like a curse. Sometimes I'd pick up my phone, type out long apologies I'd never send. I wanted to tell her I wasn't the same person anymore, that I thought about her every single day. But I never hit send, because apologies don't fix what's broken when the damage is who you are. Years slipped by quietly. I got promoted, moved to a bigger apartment, made new friends. From the outside, I looked fine, maybe even happy. But inside, I was hollow. Relationships never lasted. Whenever someone got close, I'd pull away, terrified that if they really saw me, they'd see the rot underneath. I told myself I didn't deserve love, and maybe I was right. Then, one afternoon about 5 years later, something unexpected happened. I ran into an old family friend, Mrs. Carter, at a cafe downtown. She had known Eve and her family for years. We hugged, made small talk, and just when I thought I could escape the conversation untouched, she said, "You've heard about Eve, right?" My heart stopped. I shook my head. "What about her?" Mrs. Carter smiled softly. "She's doing well. Really well, actually. She opened her own art studio. You should see her. So at peace. It's beautiful." Peace. That word hit me like a stone. For a moment, I didn't know whether to cry or smile. I pictured Eve surrounded by her paintings, laughing again, her eyes free of the heaviness I'd put there. I wanted to be happy for her, and I was, but there was also this sharp ache inside me, knowing I wasn't part of her new piece. I had been erased, and rightfully so. That night, I went home and sat in the dark for hours. I realized that I'd been waiting, maybe unconsciously, for some kind of closure that was never going to come. I had wanted Eve to forgive me, not for her sake, but for mine. Because deep down, I believed her forgiveness was the only thing that could save me from myself. But hearing that she had found peace without me was the moment I understood what true accountability meant. It's learning to live with what you've done, even when forgiveness never comes. In the months that followed, something inside me shifted. I started therapy for the first time in my life. It was brutal at first, having to talk about things I'd spent years burying. My therapist told me that guilt, when left unchecked, turns into self-hatred. "You can't heal," she said, "if you keep defining yourself by the worst thing you've ever done." I cried more in those sessions than I had in years. But slowly, something began to change. I learned to separate who I was from what I did. I started volunteering at a women's shelter, pouring my time into helping people who needed support. It didn't erase my past, but it gave me purpose again. Sometimes when the guilt resurfaced, because it always did, I'd write letters to Eve. I never sent them, of course. They were just my way of speaking to her, of saying all the things I couldn't say out loud. One letter started like this. Open quote, "Dear Eve, if I could go back, I would have run from him the moment I felt something I shouldn't have. I would have chosen you over every moment of weakness. You didn't deserve the pain I gave you. You never did. I hope the world has been kind to you. I hope you found someone who sees your light the way I should have. I hope one day when you think of me, it doesn't hurt anymore." Close quote. Writing that letter didn't fix anything, but it lightened something inside me. 5 years had turned me into someone else. Not better, just more aware. I still lived with the memory, the guilt, but it didn't crush me the way it used to. It became a scar, something I'd always carry, but not something that defined every breath I took. Then, one spring morning, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. My heart skipped when I saw the name. Eve. It was short. Just 4 words. Open quote. "I heard you're doing better." Close quote. I stared at the screen for a long time. I wanted to reply, to pour out everything I'd kept inside all these years. But I didn't. I typed, open quote, "I'm trying. I'm glad you're happy." Close quote. She replied with a single heart emoji. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was something, an acknowledgement that I still existed somewhere in her world, even if only as a faint echo. That small moment didn't undo the past, but it gave me peace in a way nothing else had. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like running from myself. The message from Eve replayed in my head for days. "I heard you're doing better." It was so small, yet it echoed louder than anything I'd heard in years. I couldn't tell if she meant it kindly or if it was just a neutral gesture, but I clung to it anyway. It was the first time in almost 7 years that she'd acknowledged me, and that single moment cracked something open inside me that I didn't know was still there. Weeks passed before I gathered the courage to message her again. My hands trembled as I typed. "Would you like to meet? Just for coffee." I hovered over the send button for a long time, heart racing, afraid she'd block me, ignore me, or worse, say yes. But I sent it. Her reply came hours later. Just one word, okay. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining how it would go. The awkward silence, the questions I'd be too afraid to ask, the pain that might rise up again. I even rehearsed what I'd say, though deep down I knew no words could ever be enough. When the day finally came, I arrived early. The cafe was quiet, the kind of place where soft music played and people spoke in low voices. I sat by the window, fingers curled around a cup of coffee I couldn't taste. Every sound, the door opening, footsteps approaching, made my heart jump. Then she walked in. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Eve looked older, but not in a tired way. There was a calmness to her now, a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Her hair was shorter, her face softer, like someone who had finally made peace with her story. And when our eyes met, I saw no anger, just recognition. "Hi," I managed to say. My voice cracked. She nodded slightly. "Hi." The air between us was heavy, but not hostile. We sat, both unsure of where to begin. I waited for her to speak first, but she just stirred her drink slowly, watching the spoon circle, like time folding in on itself. Finally, she said, "I wasn't sure I'd actually come." I swallowed hard. "I wasn't sure you should." A small, almost sad smile tugged at her lips. "I thought about it for days, but I think I needed to see you, not to reopen anything, just to look at you and not feel angry anymore." Her words hit me like a slow wave. "You have every right to still hate me." "I did," she said simply. "For a long time. You and Andrew both. I hated you so much it made me sick. But then one day, I realized the hate was keeping me trapped in that moment. You moved on, he moved on, and I was still standing in the ashes, so I stopped feeding it." I couldn't stop the tears that came. "Eve, she raised a hand gently. "Don't apologize again. You've done that in your letters." I froze. "You got them?" She nodded. "Your aunt gave them to me. Said she found them years ago when she was helping your mother pack. I didn't read them right away. But I did, eventually." My heart pounded. "Then you know everything I wanted to say." She looked at me steadily. "Yes, I know, and I believe you. I know you were sorry. I know you've suffered too." She paused, her voice softening. "But that doesn't mean I can forget. I just learned to live without needing to." There was silence for a moment, the kind that feels both unbearable and sacred. I nodded slowly. "I understand." Eve exhaled. "You know, for a long time, I blamed myself too. I kept wondering what I'd done wrong, what made him wander, what made you, my own blood, cross that line. But I see now it wasn't about me. It was about both of you being lost. And I just happened to be in the path of your storm." "I was broken," I whispered. "Not an excuse, but it's the truth. I thought what I felt was love, but it was emptiness trying to fill itself." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I figured that out too. I think we were all broken then. Andrew and I never stood a chance after that. But looking back, I think maybe we weren't meant to. Sometimes destruction clears space for something new." We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about the affair, there was nothing left to dissect, but about everything else. Her art studio, her travels, my work, the people we'd become in the years since. It was strange, comforting and painful at once. At one point, she laughed softly. "You still bite your lip when you're nervous," she said. I smiled faintly. "And you still stir your coffee for too long before drinking it." It was the kind of exchange that made time blur, the kind that reminded me that before all the pain, we had once loved each other deeply. Not as rivals or strangers, but as cousins, almost sisters. When it was time to leave, I stood up first. "Thank you for coming, Eve." She looked at me, really looked, and said, "You know what's strange? Sitting here with you, I realized I don't hate that part of my life anymore. It broke me, yes, but it also made me rebuild differently. Stronger, softer maybe. And for that, I guess I can't resent you forever." I blinked through tears. "You have no idea what that means to me." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." We walked outside together. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft golden hue over the street. For a moment, it felt like the world was giving us a small grace, an unspoken acknowledgement that some endings don't have to be bitter, they can just be. We stood there, uncertain, before she said, "Take care of yourself, okay?" "I will," I said, meaning it this time. As she turned to leave, I called out her name. She turned slightly, her face half lit by the fading light. "Eve," I said, my voice trembling, "I hope your peace lasts forever." She smiled. "It already has." And just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a long time, watching her disappear into the evening crowd, a strange calm settling over me. It wasn't closure in the way I once imagined it. No grand forgiveness, no dramatic reconciliation, but it was real. It was enough. For the first time in years, I felt light. The ghosts that had haunted me for so long seemed quieter, as if seeing her, hearing her voice, her calmness, had finally let them rest. I walked home slowly, taking in every sound, every scent of the evening, realizing that peace isn't something you find. It's something you build, one breath at a time. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't feel guilt or shame, just gratitude. That even in the wreckage, life had given me a second chance to face what I broke and learn to live again. Months passed after that meeting, yet I carried the memory of it like a fragile stone, heavy but smooth from being held too long. I'd replay our conversation in quiet moments, not to dissect it, but to remind myself that healing wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was a whisper, a shared silence, a look that said, "We survived it." Life began to take on color again. I started noticing the small things I'd ignored for years, the laughter of strangers on the street, the hum of the city at dawn, the smell of fresh rain on concrete. For the first time, I wasn't walking through life like a ghost. I was living it. Therapy became less about what I'd done and more about who I was becoming. My therapist once said something that stuck with me. "You can't erase your story, but you can write beyond the worst page." That line stayed with me. Every morning when I woke up, I chose to keep writing, to do one small thing that proved I was still worthy of being alive, of being better. The guilt never vanished completely, but it transformed. It wasn't a chain anymore. It was a compass. It reminded me of the kind of person I never wanted to be again. I learned that redemption isn't about being forgiven. It's about changing so deeply that the person who committed those sins wouldn't recognize who you've become. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since my teens, back when Eve and I used to share sketchbooks and laugh about our messy lines. At first, it was just therapy, a way to quiet my mind. But slowly, it became something more. I painted feelings I couldn't put into words. Remorse, hope, loss, rebirth. I filled canvas after canvas with color, not perfection. One evening, I decided to visit Eve's art studio. I didn't tell her I was coming. I just wanted to see the space that had saved her. The walls were covered in pieces bursting with emotion. Flashes of light and shadow, chaos and calm. And there, tucked in a corner, was a small canvas with a handwritten quote beneath it. Open quote, "We are not defined by what breaks us, but by what we build after." Close quote. I stood there for a long time, tears stinging my eyes. It was her handwriting. I wanted to believe that quote was her message to herself, but part of me wondered if it was also for me. A few weeks later, I hosted a small exhibition of my own. I titled it Rebirth. The room was modest, the crowd small, but every piece told a fragment of my story: grief, guilt, surrender, healing. One painting drew the most attention, a swirling mix of crimson and gold. I named it Her Blood, My Guilt. When people asked what it meant, I said it's about forgiveness, the hardest kind, the one you give yourself. That night, as the lights dimmed and the crowd thinned, I saw Eve walk in. My breath caught. She looked radiant, calm, confident, at peace. She walked straight to that painting, studied it quietly, and then turned to me. "This one," she said softly. "It's you, isn't it?" "Yes," I whispered. "It's everything I've carried." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "It's beautiful, painful, but beautiful." We stood side by side, not needing to say more. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was sacred. The kind of silence that exists between two souls who finally put down their weapons. After a while, she reached out and touched my arm lightly. "You know," she said, "for the longest time, I thought forgiveness meant letting someone back into your life. But now I know it's just letting yourself stop bleeding over what cut you." I swallowed hard. "Thank you for teaching me that." She smiled faintly. "We both learned, didn't we?" When she left that night, I didn't cry. I didn't crumble. I just stood there in the empty gallery, looking at the painting that had once represented my shame and realizing it had become something else entirely, a symbol of transformation. That night, I wrote in my journal, open quote, "There's no undoing the past, but there's grace in facing it. There's freedom in forgiving yourself, even when no one else can." Close quote. From then on, I lived differently. I started speaking at small events about emotional accountability, healing, and forgiveness. Not as a teacher, but as someone still learning. People would share their own stories of betrayal and regret, and I'd tell them what I'd learned the hard way, that redemption is slow and it doesn't come through punishment, it comes through persistence. Years later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly. Eve's. Inside was a small note and a photograph. The note read, "Open quote, I thought you'd like to see this. I sold one of your paintings at my gallery. A woman said it reminded her of her own healing. I didn't tell her the story. I just told her it was painted by someone who learned how to turn guilt into grace." Close quote. The photo showed my painting hanging on a white wall, sunlight spilling across it. I smiled through tears. That single image said everything words couldn't, and in that moment, I realized something. Forgiveness isn't a destination. It's a rhythm, something you return to over and over, each time softer than before. I walked to the window, looked out at the city lights, and whispered to the night, "I'm free." Not because I'd been forgiven by her or by anyone else, but because I'd finally forgiven myself.